Hey, what's going on, guys? So React 19 is just around the corner, and it will include some major changes and improvements. And there's already a bunch of YouTube videos talking about those changes, and we're going to do that for a few minutes, but I want to jump into the React experimental build and explore some of the changes and features, including the new use hook, the form actions, as well as some of the new hooks like useFormState, useFormStatus, useOptimistic, a lot of these hooks that are going to become stable in version 19. Now, I am right now in the middle of creating my 2024 React crash course, and that will most likely be released before React 19 is. However, the fundamentals of what you would learn in a crash course aren't really going to change as far as how to create a component, how to pass props, how to use the React router, things like that. So if you're looking to learn React, the crash course will be out soon. All right, so the GitHub repo with the final code for this video will be in the description. It's basically what we're going to build is just a bunch of tiny projects that use some of the newer features that React 19 will use. And some of this stuff has been in the Canary builds for a while, but they're set to be stable for version 19. All right, before we do that, though, let's talk about some of the major changes in React 19. So the first and the most major change is that React will now use a compiler. And you may notice that a lot of the big frameworks seem to copy each other, and React is no different. So they're taking a page from Svelte's playbook and some of the other frameworks, and they've created a new compiler that will compile your React code into regular JavaScript, potentially doubling performance. And what's even better than the performance gains, at least in my opinion, is that it's going to make React a little bit easier to work with. Because I don't know about you guys, but I feel like a lot of the newer frameworks like Svelte, Vue, and even projects like Astro, they just do things in a much easier and more intuitive way than React does, even though React is the most popular front-end framework. And I think it's kind of fallen behind in that regard. So it looks like this compiler is going to bring React up to speed and make things easier when it comes to things like unnecessary re-renders, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And the compiler will model both the rules of JavaScript and the rules of React, things like immutable props, immutable state values. So this will make React a bit more forgiving and will let you bend the rules a little bit. However, many developers want their code to abide by those rules. So in that case, you can enable React strict mode, and you can also configure the React ESLint plugin and things like that. Now, the compiler is actually being used now in production with Instagram, so it's not like it's just some experimental thing that may or may not happen. And a lot of the features that I'm going to be talking about are in direct relation and possible because of this compiler. So let's talk about some of those changes that the compiler will bring in addition to just overall performance. So first off, it'll do automatic memoization, which is the process of optimizing components to prevent unnecessary re-renders, which has kind of been a pain point with React for a lot of years now. And I'm talking about re-rendering components when no props have changed or anything like that. And traditionally, we would use hooks like useMemo and useCallback to kind of combat this, which I always found to be annoying, not just to use, but also to teach. They're kind of difficult to explain. So I'm really excited to see memoization become automated. And truthfully, I think with most developers, including myself, I think that the compiler will do a better job than we would, because sometimes it can be difficult to figure out where should I use memo and things like that. So I'm just glad that these hooks aren't going to, we're not going to need these anymore. Now, there is a new hook just called use. It's not use something, it's just use. And this allows us to read and asynchronously load the value of a resource, such as a promise or even context. In fact, use, like this, use and then passing in context, is going to completely replace the use context hook, which I know can be annoying because you may have just learned about the use context hook, and this seems to happen a lot with React. I'm not someone that just constantly praises the framework. I think it has a lot of shortcomings, and one of them is just that you just have to keep learning new things, and then that is you no longer need it anymore, then you're going to learn something else. So that can be kind of a pain in the ass, and I totally get that. I do think at some point it'll really slow down, and we'll just have a way of doing things that they're satisfied with, hopefully. All right, so if you've used Next.js, you've probably used React Server components and the use client and use server directives. So they've been available in the Canary version for a while now. React 19 will have built-in support for them. This means better SEO, faster load times, easier data fetching with server components. And you use these directives at the top of the component file, and they basically let you write both client-side and server-side code in the same file. Now, obviously, you need to have a server to use the use server directive, but it's a huge step forward for React, and I'm sure that we'll see more meta frameworks emerge that will make it easier to use server components. Now, another huge change is Actions, or the Actions API, which up to this point, with client-side React, we would have to have a submit handler on a form and then make our request from a function or whatever it is we're doing. And now we can actually use the action attribute on a form to handle the submission. And this is something that you might be familiar with if you've used Next.js or Remix, but now it's a stable, or it will be a stable feature of React. And it can be used for both server and client-only applications. It can also operate synchronously or asynchronously, and this is going to make working with forms much easier and more intuitive. We also have new hooks like useFormState and useFormStatus that work really well with Actions, and I'm going to give you some examples of how to use these in a little bit. Actions are also automatically submitted within a transition, which will keep the current page interactive while the action is processing. And we have the ability to use async await in transitions. So this will allow you to show a pending UI while with the is pending state of a transition. Now, another hook that is set to no longer be experimental in React 19 is useOptimistic. And this hook can be used to apply a temporary optimistic update to the UI while we wait for things like the server to respond. So using this hook with Actions, you can optimistically set the state of the data on the client, such as showing a post. So if you submit a post, if you're creating a new one and you want to display it, it'll display right away before the server even responds. Or if let's say you like an article or you like a post, it'll show that before the server actually responds. So it just gives you a faster and more responsive experience. Now, another thing that you won't really need to do anymore is use third-party packages for SEO and metadata, because React 19 will have built-in support for metadata such as titles, descriptions, keywords, and you can actually put it anywhere in your component. Like you could just put a title tag anywhere in the component and it'll just work. And it works the same way in all environments, including fully client-side code and server-rendered code. All right, so these are just some of the other small changes. Ref is now going to be passed as a regular prop. So traditionally, we would use forward ref, which lets your component expose a DOM node to a parent component with a ref. And this is no longer needed because ref will just be available as a regular prop. Asset loading, so that's another improvement. You've probably had times where you load a page and you get a flicker of unstyled content. That shouldn't really be an issue anymore because now asset loading integrates with suspense. And this means that you'll have a smoother experience. And let's say, for instance, you have a really high-res image. Asset loading will make sure that that image is ready before it's displayed. And then React 19 will have better support for web components. And I couldn't find much information on this on the blog post or anywhere else. But better support for web components means you can build, reusable components easier and even mix and match with other frameworks. And then the compiler, like I said, it's going to offer a lot of automation. It'll do things like lazy loading and code splitting, and we're not going to have to use react.lazy anymore for lazy loading components. And then the context.provider element will just be replaced with context. So those are pretty much all the major changes that I could find. Now what I want to do is jump into the experimental build of React. I've just set up just a Vite server, and I installed the experimental build, and we're going to look at things like the use hook. We're going to look at form actions and some of the newer hooks that go along with that. All right, so let's get into it. All right, guys, so I have this React 19 playground, and basically I created just these really small projects for each one of these to kind of demonstrate how the use hook works in different ways and how actions work, how some of these newer hooks that work with actions work. And I have the starter version here, which I have open in VS Code, and then I also have the finished version here in case I need to show you the final project. Now, I'm not going to do all these from scratch. I basically have all the code here already except what I want to show you. So I'll go through and we'll add the new stuff so that you can learn how those work. All right, and I'm probably not going to type everything out. I'll paste some stuff in because I don't want this to take too long. I know that these days people don't, it seems that a lot of people don't like longer videos and to follow along and type everything out. So I'll try to make it quicker, but just kind of bear with me. And you have the code in the description if you need to see that at any time. So this first one, it says use the use hook to fetch a random joke from the Chuck Norris API. So basically we're going to use the use hook in place of useEffect. So if I view this, you'll see that it actually does work, even on the starter version. And the reason for that is because if we look in our components and then use example 1, I'm fetching the jokes using useEffect, just the plain old useEffect way that we've been doing it for years. So making the request, I'm filling the state, so set joke, set loading, we're checking for loading, and if we have the joke, we're passing it in as a prop to this joke item component. So many of these will have multiple components, but they'll all be in the same file just to make it easier and keep everything in one place. Now, I also want to mention that I'm using the experimental version of React and React DOM. So the way that I set this up is I just set up a Vite server, I set up Tailwind, and then I just did npm install react at experimental and npm install react DOM at experimental. So if you want to just kind of create your own project from scratch to follow along, then that's what I did. All right, so let's go ahead and take this regular old use effect and turn it into fetching data with the use hook. So instead of bringing in use effect and use state, I'm going to bring in just use, and I'm also going to bring in suspense because we want to use a suspense boundary around where we use the use hook. And then down here, actually, let's create our function first. So I'm going to create a function to fetch the data. So let's say fetch data, and I'm using an arrow function, but of course you can use a regular one if you want. And then we're going to say const res and set that to await, and then we'll use fetch. And then the URL for this is https, and then it's going to be api.chucknorris.io and then /jokes/random. And then what we want to return from this is just res.json. We don't want to put an await here because the use hook will actually resolve that promise for us. So just return res.json. Now down here we can completely get rid of the state, so those lines. We can completely get rid of the use effect. And even the loading, since we're going to be using a suspense boundary, we can pass in a fallback and put whatever we want for the loading. So we can get rid of that if statement as well. And then we're not going to pass the joke in as a prop because I'm actually going to use the use hook in the joke item. So we can get rid of this. And then all we have to do here is say const joke. We're going to set that to the use hook, and we're going to pass in fetch data with parentheses, and then that should fetch the data and get it to us. And then we have joke, which is going to be the object that we get back, and that has a value at value property, and that will be the actual joke. Now, if I were to run this as is without the suspense boundary, it's going to continuously make requests, so we don't want that. So down here, let's add in suspense, and then we just want to pass this joke item is going to go inside of that. And that by itself should work. If we come back over here, you'll see it does work. Every time I reload, it makes a request and I get my joke. Now, I do want to show the loading. I mean, you could show whatever you want, but I'm just going to use text. So with suspense, we can just pass in fallback And I'll just do an H2 with a couple classes. Let's do text dash 2XL, text dash center, font dash bold, and margin top 5. So we'll go ahead and just say loading dot dot dot. So now when it's actually fetching, it should show that loading. And that's it. So to me, this looks much cleaner than what we just had with the use effect. And I'm not saying you should always use this hook instead of use effect. It's not meant for that. It's not meant to just completely replace it like it is with use context, but it is an option. Now the next one is for posts. So we're going to use the use hook to fetch some posts from the JSON placeholder API, and you'll see it's working because once again, I'm using use effect and put in this use example 2 posts. So again, we're just going to refactor this to use the use hook. And if you want, you can pause the video and try it yourself because we're basically going to be doing the same exact thing. In fact, I'll just paste some of this stuff in as well. So let's bring in use and suspense. And then for the function, we're going to have fetch posts. Same thing, we're just fetching from a different place this time and returning just res.json, no await. And then let's go down here. We're not going to pass in post as a prop. And then, excuse me, we can say const posts and set that to the use hook. And then pass in here fetch posts. And let's come back down here. We don't need the state. We don't need the use effect. We don't need the if loading. And then for the, I'm just going to paste this in as well. So we're just going to return a suspense boundary with a fallback. Same thing, just add an H, make it an H2, and then post items. Okay, so save that, come back over here, and now we're fetching our posts. So very simple. Now the next one is here. All I have here is a button, right? So if we go to use hook example 3, it's just a button, it doesn't do anything. If we go to the finished version, what I want it to do is basically just use the use hook to resolve just a regular promise, not a fetch request. So if I click download, it says downloading message for a second, and then it says here's the message and shows us a little react symbol. Okay, so let's do that. Now this promise that I want to resolve, we're going to pass it around through a couple different components. So we're going to write a little bit more code than in the last one. And we're also going to put it in state. So we are going to bring in use, but we're also going to bring in use state. And then also we want to bring in suspense. And that's going to be from React. Okay, then we'll create a function. Let's call it fetch message. We're not actually fetching anything. We're just creating a promise, and we're going to use a set timeout. So let's just say return a new promise and pass in a function, pass in our resolve. And then all I'm going to do is set timeout, call resolve after a second, so after 1,000 milliseconds. And then the message itself is just going to be a little React icon. So let me just grab that. I mean, you could put whatever you want in here as the message. But yeah, it's just going to resolve a promise. Oops, I forgot my equal sign and my arrow. Okay, now next thing, let's come down to the main message component. That's where we want to have our state. So I'm just going to paste in our 2 lines of state. So we have message promise, and then we have show. And message promise is set to null by default. Show is set to false. Then on the button, we're going to have an on click, and let's set that to a function called download. And then we're going to put that right above the return. So download, and let's set that equal to a function where all we're doing is setting our state. So set message promise, that's going to be set to fetch message. And then we're going to set show to true. All right. Now, if show is set to true, let's come down here and let's say if show, then I want to return a message container component, which we haven't created yet. And that message container, I'm going to pass in the message promise from state as a prop. So we'll pass that in. Else, so if not show, then we just want to return our button. So we can just grab that and put that in the else. Okay, and we still just see our button. If I click it, message container is not defined. So let's do that. I'm going to come up here above the message component and paste in the message container component, which just takes in the promise. And ultimately, we're going to render a suspense boundary with a fallback with this downloading message, and then a message output component that takes in the promise. So that's the last component we'll put in here. And that output takes in the promise, and that's where we use the use hook. Okay, so we're resolving this promise right here, which is going to resolve to this React icon. We're going to put that in a variable called message content and then just show here is the message. All right, so now let's save that. Let's come back over to example 3. Click download. We see download message for a second, and then it says here's the message and shows us the React icon. All right, so it's just to show you that use can take in just a regular promise. It doesn't have to be fetching data. Now, it can also take in context. So let's look at the next one. So use context example, and you'll see that this actually does work because I have it all set up already using the use context hook, which we've used for years now. So let's go into use example context theme.jsx. And you'll see there's quite a bit of code here, but I'll go through and just explain it all. There's only 2 things we have to change here, but I want you to understand how it works in case you haven't really done this before. So we're bringing in create context, and we're creating a theme context. And with context, you have to have a provider, and with that provider, we're setting our state, so the theme here, we're setting it to light by default. Okay, so we have a piece of state called theme. We also have a function called toggle theme that will set the theme to the opposite of the current state. So if it's light, it'll be dark. If it's dark, it'll be light when we call this function. And then we just have our provider wrapping the children. Whatever's passed in is going to be wrapped with this provider. And down here, you'll see it's wrapping this theme card component, which is this right here. And we're getting the context using the use context hook. So this is the way we've done it for a long time. And we can get the theme state, which is either light or dark, and the toggle theme function, which changes it. So here we're just changing the class based on if it's light or dark, changing the class here for the H1, changing the class for the paragraph based on light or dark, and then there's a button that calls toggle theme. And also if it's dark or light, it's going to change the text of the button. So if we click the button, it calls that toggle theme and it changes the state. Now the only thing I really want to show you here is that we can, instead of using use context, we can bring in use, and where we call use context right here in the theme card, we can simply change that to use. And if we do that and come back here, click the button, it still works perfectly. Okay, so use context is going to be phased out now by this use hook, as far as I can tell, as far as everything that I've read. Remember, this stuff is all new to me too, so if I do get something wrong, feel free to let me know. Also, if you have other features that you want to add, if you want to make a pull request to the repository, I'd be happy to look at it. All right, so now that's pretty much it for the use stuff. Now let's take a look at some of the actions. So this one here, we have a post form, and I basically just want to connect an action that will allow us to submit a post and show it down below. So we're doing some things in addition to just showing you how the action works. So let's go to action example 1, posts, and basically we have our post form, no action, no on-click or anything like that. Notice we do have name attributes in the input. That's really important. I'll talk about that in a second. And then down below, I'm just embedding that post form. So the first thing that I want to do is go to the form itself, the form tag, and we just add an action attribute. So if you've ever used like PHP, this is kind of the same thing. And that's kind of People joke about that now, but we are kind of reverting backwards to how it used to be, which is fine because I didn't mind the way it used to be. As long as we also have the ability to create dynamic UIs, I like the server stuff. And we're not even doing any server stuff here because action is now allowed in client-only apps. So I think that's really cool. So you can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call it form action. And then we're just going to create that function here, const form action. Now, since it's an action, we have access to form data. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is just create an object called new post. So we'll call it new post. Geez, I can't type. New post, and set that to an object with a title. Now remember, since I have this name, I have name title here and I have name body here. So I can access those in here with form data dot get. Okay, we have a get method, and then pass in whatever the name is that you're looking for. So title, and then let's also do body. Change that to body, and then let's just do a console log of the new post. And then if we come over here and let's open up the console and just put whatever in here, submit, and there we go. So I didn't have to do an on click and use an event handler. I simply added an action just like back in the day. So now, I mean, that's pretty much it as far as how do you use an action, but I would just want to take it a step further and finish up this little project so we can add posts. So I'm going to change the console log here to add post. And since this is a different component, I'm going to pass in add post as a prop. And then down here, where we actually call post form, that will have add post. And we'll set that to a function here called add post. I mean, if you want to change up the names, you can. But we'll do that. And then let's say const add post. We'll do that. Now I do want to have some state, so let's bring in up top here. Let's import useState, and then let's add the state. So let's see right here, we'll say const, and let's say posts, set posts, set that to useState, and we'll just set it to an empty excuse me, an empty array by default. All right, and then in the add posts, we just need to simply call set posts, and what I want to set it to, I'm going to pass in a function here, because with this function I can get my previous state, so previous posts, and I just want to set it to an array where I spread across the previous state, and then I just add the new post. All right, so we can do that. Now, this will add it to the state if I submit, but we're not going to see it anywhere because we haven't added that yet. So let's come below the post form, and let's take the post in the state. Let's add dot map, and then in the dot map, we're going to pass in post and index. Set that to a set of parentheses, and in there for the JSX we want to return, let's have a function, but a component called form item. All right, and we'll pass in the key, which I'm going to use index, and pass in the post, which is going to be the post. Okay, and then that post item component, I'm just going to paste that in up top here, very simple. Takes in the post prop and shows a div with an H2 and a paragraph. So now let's come back over here and just put in whatever, submit. New post is not defined. Let's see, where did I screw that up? So let's see, we have our add post. So right here, that needs to take in new post. So now, there we go. So now I can just add posts. All right, so that's that. That's how you can use an action. Now we're going to do another example to get familiar with actions, and it's a little bit different. So basically, I'll show you the finished version first, and we're going to have these add to carts, and each one of these is a form with a button and a hidden ID. And basically I want to make it so that when we click the button in that form, it calls an action and then adds it to the cart. So you can see that that JavaScript definitive guide is in our cart. If I click this one, that gets put in the cart. All right, so that's what we want to do. So let's go to action example 2. And all I have right now is a cart. If we look at the code, the main component is called shopping cart. It has a piece of state called cart with a hard-coded Traversy Media ebook. It has an ID and a title. We have a cart display that gets passed in the state of cart, and then it basically just loops through and shows the items that are in the cart. And then up here we have our add cart to form, which we haven't embedded anywhere, but this is the form that I want to add the action to. So before we add the action, let's actually show some of these add to cart forms. And it takes in an ID, a title, and then the add to cart function. So down at the bottom here, let's go under the, we want to go under the cart display, and let's say add to cart form. We want to pass in a couple things here. So ID, let's set that to a string of 1. And let's set the title to, let's say JavaScript, the definitive guide. And then it also needs, so ID title, and then it has that add to cart function. So we'll have to have a function here called add to cart. Then I'm going to paste that down, or copy that down, set that to 2. Let's call this one JavaScript, the good parts, and save that. And now if we look at add to cart is not defined. So basically this needs to be defined in this component. So let's say const add to cart. Okay, so now we can see our buttons. And what I'm going to do now is add an action to the add to cart form. So let's come up here, let's say action, set that to, and again I'm just going to call it form action, and then in the add to cart form, let's say const form action. Now this, I'm going to make this function asynchronous because basically it's going to call the add to cart down here, which is going to have a promise. Okay, so basically we're just going to have like a set timeout in a promise, similar to what we did with the message. So this, all this is going to do is, let's do a try catch, and then we'll say await, await add to cart. And then in this, we want to pass in a couple things. So one is going to be the form data. So remember, when we submit this, and we need to pass in form data here. Just like in the last little project, when we use an action, we have access to that form data. And remember, you want to have a name, and what we want to get is the ID, so you can see that has a name of item ID, so that's important. And then we're just awaiting, calling add to cart, passing in the form data. Now the form data only has the ID. We also want to pass the title in here as well, which comes in through a prop. And then in the catch, we'll just do a console log error. Okay, so now this gets submitted to add to cart, which is going to get submitted to this. So what we want to do in that function is, first of all, we want to make this async, and then we're going to pass in form data, title. Okay, so we're passing this form data around. And then let's get the ID. So we'll say ID equals, make sure that's string. So string. And then in here we'll do form data dot get, and we want to get the item ID. Make sure that that matches the name. Then I'm going to basically simulate an AJAX call with a promise. So I'm going to say await promise, or await, sorry, new promise. And then pass in function, resolve, and then again I'm just going to do set timeout, call resolve, and then the time I'm going to wait is just 1,000 milliseconds. Then once that happens, once we wait that second, then we're going to set our cart. Okay, we're going to add it to our state, and that's going to take in a function with the previous state of cart, and then we're going to set it to an array where we spread across the previous state, and then we add an object with the ID and the title. Oops, ID, comma, title. All right, and then finally we'll just return an object with the ID. So let's try it out. We'll come over here. We have this Traversy Media ebook. I could probably just get rid of that and just pass in an empty array. And then I'll click add to cart, waits a second, gets added, click it, waits a second, gets added. All right, and it waits a second because of this here. If I get rid of that and we try it, it'll just add, right away. Okay, so that's just another example of using an action. Now the next thing I want to get into is the useFormStatus example, and we're going to use our post example for this. So this does work as far as adding posts, but what we can do with useFormStatus is we can have our button either disabled or have it say some different text or do whatever we want while the form is actually submitting. So let's go to the form useFormStatus example, and it's called post.jsx. This is basically the same code we left off with back in the first action example. So what we're going to add to this is up top we want to bring in our useFormStatus. Now this is going to come in from React DOM, not React, so that's important to remember. So let's say useFormStatus, and that's going to be from react-dom. Now, one of the pitfalls with this, and it says this in the documentation, is that this hook only returns status information for a parent form and not for any form rendered in the same component. So instead of adding the stuff directly to the button here, we're going to put this button into a separate component. So let's grab the button and let's cut it, and then we'll go right above. Let's go above the post form, and let's say post form button button component, and we'll call this submit. Okay, so this submit button, I'm going to return and then paste in the button here. And what we can do is get the pending state. So let's say const and then destructure pending from useFormStatus. Okay, and I'm just going to console log pending so you can see basically it'll start as false, and when it's submitting, then it'll turn to true. And then what do we want to change in the button when it's pending? Well, first off, let's make it disabled. So we'll say disabled and then set that to pending, which is going to be true or false. And then for the text, let's do this. Let's say if pending, then we'll say submitting ... else, then we'll say submit. Okay, so we're changing the state based on that. Then back down here where we cut the button, let's just embed, or let's call it submit button. So up here, say submit button. All right, so now I'm going to save that. And if I come back here and reload this, put some crap in here, submit, you'll see it did flicker, so it is working. But I want to make that last a little longer. So what we can do is go into the submit, or I should say the action, this form action, and let's go right above the new post here, and let's say simulate a delay of 2 seconds. So we'll just do set timeout. Actually, we're going to make this a promise. So let's say await new promise, and then pass in resolve, and then set timeout, resolve, and let's do 2 seconds, so 2000 milliseconds. Okay, and yeah, this is already asynchronous, so let's save that. And now, if we try this again, you can see for 2 seconds it says submitting, and it's also disabled, so I can't keep clicking it. Okay, I can't click it until this is done. All right, so that's useFormStatus. So now we're going to look at useFormState. So let's go into useFormState and then add to cart form. So if I show you the finished version of useFormState, basically what I want to do is attach a state of a message. And for this item, for this form, if I click, we get added to cart. For this one, let's say this one's out of stock. So for this one, the message will be couldn't add to cart, item is sold out. So we can attach the state to the form with useFormState. So let's go back to our version here. So useFormState, and I just have the buttons, and they don't do anything, right? So basically we just have our add to cart form. Now I'm doing it a little bit different. I exported add to cart form, and then in the app.jsx for the route that we're visiting right now, I then embedded them here. I probably should have embedded them within the file, but it really doesn't matter for this case. Now the first thing that I want to do is bring in useFormState. So let's import useFormState, and just like useFormStatus, this is going to be from React DOM, not React. Okay, so we get that. Now let's go into our add to cart form, and we're going to say const, and then in brackets we're going to have the state, which I'm going to call message, and then we also add the form action that we're going to connect to the form, and then set that to useFormState, which is going to take in two things: the function that we want to call, which is going to be add to cart, and then also the initial state, which is going to be null. So it's the initial state for the message. And then for the form, we're going to pass in an action attribute and set that to form action. Okay, so whatever you're submitting that action to should be this function here. Then what we can do is just create this add to cart. So let's do that down at the bottom here. Yeah, we'll just go right here, and let's say const add to cart. Okay, and then what this is going to take in is the previous state and then any query data. And we can get the item ID from the form, from that hidden field, with the query data. So let's say const item ID, and set that equal to query data. So it's much like using form data, except it's query data dot get, and then item ID. So whatever the name. So remember, this is going to be whatever the name of the input where you want to get the value. So that'll get the item ID. Then I'm going to say if the item ID is equal to 1, then I'm going to return the string of added to cart. Okay, else then I'm going to return the string of could not, we'll say could not add to cart, item is sold out. All right, so whatever I'm returning here is what is going to be put in that message. Now I can show that message wherever I want. So I'm going to go under the button, and let's do a class of margin top -4. We'll do text -small, and let's do text -gray 700, and then we can output the message. So now let's try it out. If I click this one here, we get added to cart. I click this one, could not add to cart, item is sold out. So I really like this. We set the action, we pass the action into our useFormState, we call a function, and then here we can just return what we want for that state. And we can do whatever it is that we want to do in the add to cart. All right, so now the last thing that I want to look at is useOptimistic. So if we go back to, let's go right here, useOptimistic. And right now we just have a message box with a message. This doesn't work if I put something in here. I'll show you the finished version. So basically, I want to be able to put something in here, and then when I submit, you can see it says sending for a second. I think it's either 1 or 2 seconds. And what it's doing is it's just showing a temporary UI while we're waiting for a promise to resolve, whether that's, a submission to a server or what. We're not actually using a server. We're just going to use a promise with a set timeout. But same thing. We're waiting for the response, and we want to show a temporary UI. And you could show anything. I'm just choosing to show the message as well as that sending. Okay, so let's jump into useOptimistic and then this message.jsx, and I'll just go over this real quick. So we have a main message box component. That's where our main message's state is. And we have a text value, just an object with a text of message 1. That's what we're seeing on the screen. We have a thread component that it's being passed into, which is right here, being passed messages. We're showing a form in the thread component, and we're using map on messages and just showing the text. Okay, and then we have our form with no action or anything. We're going to add that. And yeah, there's nothing really going on here. So this right here is ultimately the function that we want to call, deliver message, and this is going to simulate a delay. So basically, this is where we want to show our pending UI is during this 2 seconds before it returns the message that we submit. Okay, so I just want to go to the documentation real quick to show you how this works. So it works sort of like useState, except the state we're talking about is the optimistic or the pending state. So we pass in, or we set an array here with optimistic state, and then a function to add to that optimistic state. And then it gets passed in the actual state, which in our case are the messages, as well as an update function that looks like this. And that update function takes the current state and the optimistic value, okay, whatever you want to set. So let's just grab this right here, and I'm going to put that into the thread component, okay, because that's where I'm showing my messages. And then I'm going to change a couple things up here. So let's see, instead of calling this optimistic state, because you can call this whatever you want, let's call it optimistic messages, because that's what we're putting in the state. And then we'll call this add optimistic message. And then here is going to be your actual state, which is going to be the messages. Okay, so our actual state is right here, and it's being passed in as a prop, passed in here, and then I'm putting that here as the first argument of useOptimistic. And then for the update function, the current state, I'm just going to call that state. And then the optimistic value, so that's going to be, we can call this whatever. I'm going to call it new message. All right, now we can get rid of these comments. So now we want to, we can get rid of the curly braces because we're going to return an array and spread across the current state, and then we want to add the new message, which is going to be an object with the text, which is going to be new message. And then, like I said, I want to have a sending value. So we're going to say sending and set that to true. Now this sending true isn't part of the actual state. The actual state just has a text. But you can have any state you want as your optimistic, or I like to say pending state, because that's what it is. It's what's going to show in the UI while this is pending. All right, so this add optimistic, actually before we do that, let's take our optimistic messages, and instead of using map on just messages, we want to use it on our optimistic messages. Then we have access to this sending value. So under the span, let's do, let's say if message dot sending, which remember is it's only part of the optimistic state. If that's sending, then we're going to show a small tag, and let's just add ML1 and text dash gray 500. And I just want to show in parentheses the text of sending ... Okay, so now we need to be able to call this add optimistic message, and that's going to be called in the form. So let's pass in here a prop of add optimistic message and then set it to that function, to this function right here. And then in addition to that, we're going to pass in send message, which ultimately is going to be called in the main message box component to actually send the message. All right, now let's go into this form, and we're passing in both of these functions. So up in the form, let's pass in for props. We have add optimistic message and send message. And then let's see, we're going to add an action, just like we've done in the past few projects, and we'll call this form action. And then above the return, let's say const form action. Okay, and then that's going to take form data because it's connected to an action. And this is where we're going to call add optimistic message, and we want to pass in whatever is in this input, the message, which has a name of message. So that means we can use form data and use .get and message. Okay, and then after that, we're just going to call send message, which ultimately it's asynchronous, so we need to do await send message. And that's just, we're just going to pass in form data itself. Okay, and we have to add a sync to the form action. And then that should do it. So now let's go down to, let's see, so the thread here, we want to pass in send message, and then down here where we're embedding the thread, we want to say send message, and then we'll have a function called send message. Okay, and we'll create that right here. So send message. All right, now send message takes in the form data, right? Because where we actually call that is right here, and it takes in the form data. And then it's being passed up, or I should say the function's being passed down into message form, and then it's also being passed to the thread, and then ultimately it's being called here. Now, this send message, we want to make this asynchronous and take in the form data, and then let's create a message variable called sent message, and we're going to set that to await, and then this is where we call that deliver message, and that gets passed in form data, and then, well, actually we want to pass the message in, so form data dot get message. And then the last thing we want to do is call set messages, because we want to update our actual state. And we're going to pass in a function here and take our current messages, and then we just want to add the new one, so we'll set that to an array spread across current messages and add a text of sent message. And let's see, I didn't bring in useOptimistic, so let's bring that in. So now if I put something in here, let's say hello, and we see sending for 2 seconds, and then it disappears. All right, and again, I could put any state that I want in here for the optimistic message, and it has nothing to do with the main state. It could be something completely different. Okay, and then I'm just saying if that sending value is there, then show the text sending. And you can get rid of the initial message here as well. All right, and that's it. So I know this was a pretty long video, but rather than just tell you the features, I wanted to just give you some examples, and hopefully, you can find some of them useful. And that's it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.